I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Melanie Carlos, Executive Director of xMinds, the organization hosting tonight's event. Our interpreter, Aura, is on the Spanish channel, and I want to first play an audio clip with some instructions on accessing her simultaneous Spanish translation.
Para escuchar esta presentación en español, haga clic en la opción de menú Interpretación y seleccione Español.
Great. So a few housekeeping items before we begin. The speaker will be taking your questions at the end of his presentation, but please feel free to write your questions in the chat at any time. We are monitoring the chat. We have volunteers and board members from xMinds who are there to provide information and also write down your questions, and they will be asked out loud when we get to the Q&A section. And I also want to quickly mention that we are recording this webinar in both English and Spanish. We'll make the recordings and presentation slides available to you in a few days. So it's my pleasure to welcome Guy Stevens, founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I think I'm pretty safe in assuming Guy never guessed that this would be his career. He had a completely different job just a few years ago, and he and his wife were busy raising their 2 children in Southern Maryland until his son was inappropriately restrained and secluded at school. This traumatic experience pushed him into the role of becoming a fierce parent advocate, like many of you who are here tonight. Guy did his homework and researched the practices of restraint and seclusion in schools and unearthed shocking data on how often these approaches are being used. And to protect other students from going through what his son suffered, he started AASR in 2019 to change school policies and the law throughout Maryland, the country, and even the world. He is now truly a leading expert on restraint and seclusion, and he has lots of other information about alternative crisis management techniques. He has presented testimony at Congress, many state legislatures, and countless conferences for educators throughout North America. There is no one better than Guy Stevens to speak on this subject. I'd like to welcome you, Guy. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Melanie. That was quite an introduction. You know, I really appreciate that, and you know, it reminds me of when I started some of this work a number of years ago. I would often begin my presentations and say, "I'm just a dad," and that's still who I am. I'm just a dad. But you know, got involved in this, as you kind of mentioned, and I will share as we go forward. But thank you. So I will go ahead and share my screen, and we will get started. We've got a lot to cover today, and I will be trying to get as much of it through as much of it as we can. So let me go ahead and pull up my screen here. And if all has gone well, you will see my slide deck here in just one second. All right, so I'm going to assume that you are seeing my slide deck unless I see anybody give me a sign that things have gone terribly wrong. We're going to be talking about restraint and seclusion, kind of from the standpoint of what parents of autistic children should know, really parents of any child that might be subjected to restraint and seclusion. And I look forward to kind of sharing some time with you this evening. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my introduction. You just got, I think, a really good intro. You know, again, it's my children that kind of started this work that I'm doing here with the Alliance that I'm going to tell you more about in just a moment here. So I am excited to be here. Of course, I started on this journey a number of years ago. I'm a Maryland resident. You know, I live in Southern Maryland along the Chesapeake Bay. I also serve on the board of the ARC of Maryland. So very much this is kind of nice to be here and talking to a group in Maryland and talking about some of the work that's happened and some of the work that still needs to be done in terms of the state of Maryland. I could probably spend an entire hour talking a little bit about, you know, our story and what led me down this road. But given the time that we have here today, I really want to focus on some other things. But I will tell you that this started for me as a parent of a child with a disability. My son is autistic. My son, I always was involved in kind of advocating for him and helping him through the process. Um, and very involved. But my involvement changed even more when he was inappropriately restrained and secluded in a school in Calvert County, Maryland, and that led to really, I think, a lot of trauma for my son, a lot of trauma for our family, and I began a journey with something that just started as a promise. I made a very simple promise to my son one day after he had really had some traumatic experiences with restraint seclusion, and the promise was that I was going to do whatever I could to make sure that this didn't happen to him again or other kids like him. And that led me down a road of doing a lot of research, trying to understand why these things were happening, who they were happening to, and ultimately what we could do differently. As Melanie said, I never would have expected, gosh, over 5 years ago now, I would have never expected to go into this work and ultimately quit a job that I've been at for over 20 years to focus on this. But the deeper I got, the more important I realized that this was, and the more I realized that something needed to happen, not only here in Maryland, but across the country, where we're seeing a lot of things that are happening in terms of restraint and seclusion and a lot of other things. So I started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint in 2019. So we're coming up to our 5th anniversary, and really started it to focus on the issue of restraint and seclusion. What I'll say is that our mission has grown a bit. It's not just restraint and seclusion, it's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. Even more broadly, it's really about all the things that are often being done to children and youth, very often in the name of behavior. And our work is really about informing change. We want to see changes in policies and laws, but we do a lot of things related to education to help get there. Our goals are around, eliminating and reducing, punitive and outdated approaches, and really looking at the school to prison pipeline and how we can make a difference there as well. At the Alliance, we focus kind of broadly on 3 areas. We focus on legislation, education, and family support. From a legislative standpoint, we do a lot of work across the country in terms of trying to support changes in laws and policies, and that can be at a state level. I've worked at a federal level as well, but also sometimes it's even working with a school district. We've worked with school districts that actually have come to a point where they realize they want to do something different. My journey began really in Calvert County, Maryland, where I worked with the Board of Education, worked with the superintendent, worked with others, ultimately to change the policy in the county and to reduce the use of restraint and ultimately eliminate the use of seclusion. So I do a lot of work in that legislative area, but the legislative area, while important, in my mind, is probably not the most important thing we do. That's probably around the education piece, because you can pass better laws and policies. And we've seen this happen time and time again, where you pass a law intended to have a certain impact, and sometimes it doesn't have the impact we expect it to. Or sometimes we see it leads to unintended consequences. So part of this work is not just about saying, don't do these things are wrong, these things are harmful. Part of it's about saying, what are the better things we can and should do? And ultimately, how can we create better environments, not just for kids, but also for teachers and staff? And I believe firmly that you can do that. The same things that we can do to reduce the use of things like restraint and eliminate seclusion can ultimately lead to better environments for everyone. And we do a certain level of family support. So, and I would just open the invitation to anyone here watching this, either now or later, if you run into an issue around restraint or seclusion or other punitive approaches, and you're looking for help or guidance, I always welcome people to reach out, and we try to help. We try to help point people in the direction of resources, things that they might be able to do, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about here today as well. So, in terms of a couple of our key positions that I think are really important, and these probably don't surprise you, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Our belief is that seclusion is never an appropriate intervention. There's not a therapeutic or educational value to seclusion. It can lead to significant trauma. It will likely lead to an increase in stress-related behaviors. based on a tremendous amount of research and work that we've done, we don't believe seclusion is ever an appropriate intervention. And of course, we're going to define these things as we go. So if you're kind of, well, what exactly do you mean and what don't you mean? We'll get to that. Our belief around physical restraint is that the use of physical restraint should be rare, should be in fact exceedingly rare. If you're following what our state law says and what many state laws say, it really shouldn't be happening on a regular basis. And we're going to talk a bit, you probably see bolded there, imminent serious physical harm. That's something we're going to talk about quite a bit as we go through the discussion tonight, but just keep that in mind. So our agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about restraint seclusion, what it is, what are the laws that govern it, what's the history of it. We're going to talk quite a bit about the impact, what's the impact of using physical restraint and seclusion. And ultimately, I want to talk a bit about what you can do to advocate for change, not only for your child if you're going through a situation like this, but ultimately a lot of this work, and I'm sure that the xMinds community, really comes from this direction as well. But a lot of this is what can we do to create better situations for the future? So how can we change laws, policies, practices, and all of those things? So that is our agenda. I do want to say that a couple things. One, this is a conversation, and it's a difficult conversation. We're talking about some pretty tough things here, and this is in no way intended to be judgmental. Ultimately, I think we all want to see safer schools. We want to see better schools for kids, for teachers, and for staff. No one wants to see a staff member injured. No one wants to see a child injured. No one becomes an educator because they want to restrain or seclude kids. People that go into education because they want to help. They want to support children. But kind of in that vein, a lot of what we talk about is really how can we know better? And then when we know better, how can we do better? So that's a reoccurring theme I think you'll see. But again, this is not to pass judgment. And we are a community that I'm really proud of. If you look at the Alliance, we have a lot of parents, we have a lot of self-advocates, we have a lot of educators, we have a lot of paraprofessionals, administrators, psychologists, social workers, really a lot of people coming together, all with a common goal of how can we do better. And that goes to a quote that I share almost every time I speak, because I think it's one that's really important. And that is from Maya Angelou, which is do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. That's what this journey is about. And when we know better, we can have far better outcomes for everyone involved. I do want to mention, you probably already know this, but this is a sensitive topic. This can be triggering if you have experienced either yourself, and I say that, and I can't tell you how many parents that I've worked with that have had their own experiences with restraint seclusion when they were much younger. I went to schools, religious schools, where I was subjected to corporal punishment. So I know these things can be difficult to discuss, and they can also bring up some past trauma or even current difficulties you're going through. So I just want to make that point that this can be a difficult conversation. If you need to step away, if you have your video on, you need to turn it off. Whatever you need to take care of yourself, please do that. This can be tough. And of course, it is being recorded. So if you need to go back and kind of catch up on something, you can absolutely do that as well. So I'm going to begin by talking a bit about restraint and seclusion from a high level. And as I was pulling this together, I was realizing how much there is to talk about here. And we're going to try to get through quite a bit. But I want to start with some basics. I want to talk a little bit about, why is this an important issue? I'm going to share a little bit of history with you. What does this look like? This is not a new issue. What's been some of the history here? I'm going to talk a bit about Maryland law, kind of past and present, to give you an idea of kind of where we've been and where we are. And I'm going to address some myths in this section as well. So that's what you have to look forward to in this first section. I want to begin by talking about why this is important. And I just want to remind you that, again, whenever we use a physical restraint, despite any training or experience that you might have, there is always an element of danger. And, one of the things that we know is that there have been many children that have actually died being physically restrained in schools across the country. And if we look at it through that lens, we have to understand that the use of a physical restraint is the use of potentially deadly force. And when you put it in that context, you begin to really realize why this is important. I'll also share with you, and I'm going to share a short video clip here. This is the only video clip I'm going to share, but the same year that my son was last restrained and secluded at school, if we go back to the fall of 2018, he was at the time 13 years old, autistic, very much like a young man that was over across the country in California named Max Benson, same age, also autistic. Max Benson was put in a prone restraint at school. Apparently he kicked a wall, he spit, he was having a difficult time. And unfortunately that restraint led to the death of Max. And I've subsequently met his family and, had an opportunity to, in fact, his neighbor is a volunteer with the Alliance. And it really kind of hits home. I mean, I think about Max a lot because I think about what could have happened with my son. And I'll share with you that, again, I don't necessarily have time to go into all of the details, but today, my son is now in college and he's doing well. But I'm always reminded that it could have been a far different outcome. So I'm going to share a short clip with you. But again, this is in the vein of, why is this important? Why is this a really important issue?
New and disturbing details emerging tonight following the death of a local student with autism. The 13-year-old boy from Davis died after being restrained while at a specialized school in El Dorado Hills.
Not knowing what the behavior was, anything that results in death, short of him trying to kill somebody else, is not appropriate.
Tonight, the attorney for his family is speaking over what they call inaccuracies in law enforcement reports. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tony Lopez.
And I'm Adrienne Moore. New tonight, CBS 13's Angela Greenwood is live in the newsroom with more on what he had to say. Angela?
Adrienne and Tony, the attorney's main focus in all of this will be on what type of restraint was used on the teen and if it was truly warranted. But he says there's also a lot of concern about false information that's already been put out.
Max's family is in terrible grief. And they are, as I would expect, trying to deal with the shock and the loss that they face.
Shock, heartbreak, and confusion about what exactly killed 13-year-old Max Benson, a teenage student with autism who died one day after being restrained inside a classroom at the Guiding Hand School in El Dorado Hills.
All I can tell you is that an end result where a child dies under the kind of school situation in which he found himself, a death is not appropriate as an outcome.
Seth Goldstein is a seasoned child abuse attorney who's now representing the teen's family. He says it's unclear what type of restraint was used, but his job now is to find out if it was considered reasonable under the scope of the law.
If they were holding him down, and of course, if that inhibited his ability to breathe, or the fact that he hyperventilated because of the behavior that he was experiencing and was being restrained, again, that's inappropriate.
According to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, Max had become violent with a staff member last Wednesday, jeopardizing the safety of others around him. They also reported Max was 6 feet tall and weighed 280 pounds. But Golding says, according to medical records from January, he was 5'3" and weighed only 180 pounds.
I'm concerned about the fact that it is misinformation.
Authorities also reported Max had severe autism, but Goldstein says that's not true.
As I understand, he was highly intelligent, very verbal, and was not at what somebody would call severe.
Now, we did reach out to authorities about this conflicting information, but our calls were not returned.
So again, this story is always hard for me to watch, even many years down the road. I just want to put this in context of why this is really important. Here in Maryland, a couple of years ago, many of you may be aware, there was a United States Department of Justice investigation into the use of restraint and seclusion in Frederick County public schools. And of course, part of the findings of that investigation led to findings that said that children were being inappropriately restrained and secluded, and was really a violation of their rights. And that these practices were happening far more often than they should. So, why this is important, there's a lot of reasons, but, I just want you to keep in mind that the outcome from these situations can really be really horrifically terrible. So I want to talk a little bit about a brief history of this, and we could cover a lot of territory, but I'm going to go back to 2009. In 2009, the Government Accountability Office, and the Government Accountability Office is a watchdog organization that essentially our government's watchdog over other government organizations. And they were tasked with doing some research related to seclusion and restraint. And they produced a report, and the report is kind of there in the slide. The report title was Seclusions and Restraint, Selected Cases of Death and Abuse at Public and Private Schools and Treatment Centers. Every time I see that title alone, you know, it's so powerful to think that here was this study and they found cases of death and abuse due to the use of restraint seclusion in schools. This investigation actually kicked off a lot of activity around the use of restraint seclusion nationwide. And the GAO had found that, you know, here's a quote here. GAO had previously testified that these techniques can be dangerous because they may involve physical struggling, pressure on the chest, and other interruptions of breathing. Again, they found hundreds of potential cases of death and abuse related to restraint seclusion. That kicked off a lot of activity kind of at the federal level and state level. And there was actually an attempt going back to 2009 to pass federal law to reduce and eliminate restraint and seclusion. And that legislation never made it, unfortunately, but that was the first effort to pass federal law. One of the things to keep in mind here is that we do have federal law around the use of restraint and seclusion in other settings like law enforcement and healthcare, but there's no federal law that oversees the use of restraint and seclusion in schools here in the United States. So now that's not for a lack of effort, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So after that 2009 report, you know, there was that attempt to pass legislation with things not moving quickly. And of course, it's not easy to get federal legislation passed. The Department of Education began to take some action. They produced a document called the Restraint and Seclusion Resource Document back in 2012. And that document talked about, well, broadly speaking, kind of what they thought the best guidance around the use of restraint and seclusion was, given what they knew at the time. And there were a lot of things that were in that document. One of the things I'm going to highlight here, and again, I would encourage you to take a look at this document, but they talked about this idea that physical restraint or seclusion should not be used except in situations where the child's behavior poses an imminent danger of serious physical harm to self or others. And other interventions are ineffective and should be discontinued as soon as imminent danger of serious physical harm to self or others has dissipated. Again, I'm going to come back to that idea of imminent serious physical harm a couple of times, and we're going to define it here briefly as well. But I just want you to keep in mind that essentially the Department of Education at that point was saying, you shouldn't do these things unless there's a crisis, you've tried everything else you can try, and if you don't intervene, there could be serious physical harm. So that was the first guidance from the Department of Education. A few years later, the Office of Civil Rights. Now, the Office of Civil Rights under the Department of Education has a role in investigating issues that have to do with the violation of civil rights, and that can happen around disability, it can happen around race, it can happen around a number of things. But OCR has some authority in investigating things like restraint and seclusion, which, as we will see in the data, often are happening significantly more disproportionately to children with disabilities, Black and brown children, you know, and there's a civil rights issue there. And back in 2016, they put out guidance that said the use of restraint and seclusion could have such a traumatic impact on a student that if it only happened once, if it only ever happened once to that child, it could actually result in a situation that they might have new academic and behavioral difficulties that, if not promptly addressed, could lead to a denial of FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. So Office of Civil Rights, you know, back in 2016 said, you know, this is really serious. Even if you only did it once, it could result in a pretty significant problem. They also had guidance in that document that talked about the repeated use of a physical restraint or seclusion. And essentially what they said is that, you know, if they were investigating a situation where restraint and seclusion were being used repeatedly on a student, they would likely not find in the favor of the school or the district. Repeated use would be an indication that they were failing to find or meet that child's needs. So this guidance has been out there for quite some time in terms of restraint and seclusion. Back in 2019, not that long ago, the Government Accountability Office came back. And one of the things that is problematic here is that we have no federal law. State laws across the country vary wildly. Some states have fairly good laws. Some states have almost no law at all. Reporting of the use of restraint and seclusion is a huge issue. Technically, schools should be reporting the use of restraint and seclusion to the federal government under the Office of Civil Rights data collection. There's a requirement to provide data on the use of restraint and seclusion by states to the federal government. However, back in 2019, the GAO came out and said to the Department of Education, hey, there's a problem here. Your data is not accurate. It's not, it's not an accurate reflection of what's happening in terms of restraint and seclusion. In a fairly strongly worded letter, the GAO said that the department needed to address these inaccuracies. There were large districts that were found to be reporting zeros when in fact they weren't, zero restraints and seclusions. So we know that there have been issues in terms of reporting on the federal level. And of course, there are issues at the state level and local level as well. But again, kind of thinking about the history, this is part of this story here. Federal legislation, mentioned the initial bill back in 2009. There have been efforts several times now to pass federal legislation. There's a current bill called the Keeping All Students Safe Act that was proposed in 2023, but it was preceded by other iterations of that bill in prior years. And that bill would ban the use of prone and supine restraint and mechanical restraint. It would ban the use of seclusion. It would bring funding to schools to implement alternatives. This type of bill has been around for a number of years on the federal front, but has not gotten enough support to pass. And it is looking like it will probably not pass this time either. I do believe at some point we will get federal legislation, but it's been a tough road for getting federal law passed, and it's not an easy lift to get federal law passed. So let's talk a little bit about Maryland. I want to talk about what Maryland's laws are on restraint and seclusion. Maryland has a pretty active history. Back in 2003, Maryland introduced their first piece of legislation around restraint and seclusion, one of the first laws in the country. So Maryland was kind of at the forefront of some of this. Back in 2013, they updated their guidance. And remember that guidance from the Department of Education? Well, they brought that in with their guidance to say that you should not restrain or seclude unless it's a situation related to imminent serious physical harm. That's a pretty big change that happened there. In 2017, there was additional legislation. That legislation was around, there was a task force created in the state, and that legislation led to data reporting requirements, which actually enabled me to get the first ever report that came out of the state of Maryland the year after this happened, or the year it happened to my son, which was very useful in trying to understand the scope of this issue. In 2018, the regulations were updated and certainly stronger, but they didn't follow all of the recommendations from the work group. And in 2019, there was new guidance issued, again, talking about the idea that you don't restrain or seclude unless it's a situation that involves imminent serious physical harm. And in 2022, and this was kind of on the heels of work that was being done by a lot of people throughout the state, and we were certainly part of that as well. We were able to get legislation passed to ban the use of seclusion in all our public schools. Maryland is one of a small group of states now, under 10, that have banned seclusion in some instances. But it was a big move forward in terms of our legislation. While it was fully banned in the public schools, there are limits on it in non-public schools, and that was a change as well. So there have been efforts around for quite some time. Let's go through some of the definitions here, just so that we have everybody on the same page of what are we talking about when we're talking about restraint and seclusion. Physical restraint, it really means that you're preventing somebody from moving freely on their own. It is holding them in some way that prevents them from moving their arms and their legs and their head and their torso freely. Our law kind of goes further to say, it's not just a matter of, a physical restraint is not kind of briefly holding somebody a hug or helping to calm someone down. It's not kind of a gentle hand on the back or shoulder to guide them to a different location. We have a carve out here for moving a disruptive student, which is something we need to revisit in our law. And then breaking up a fight. If you break up a fight and you're pulling people apart in Maryland, that would not be considered a physical restraint. We also want to look at the term mechanical restraint. Mechanical restraint is when you use some kind of device. And, I have a picture here of duct tape, and that's not to be sensational. There have been cases where kids have been taped to chairs. There have been cases where kids a number of years ago in Hawaii, the kids were being taped to trees. One of the more common things that we've seen is the inappropriate use of certain types of equipment that has a valid purpose that is used for restraint. So, for example, a Riften chair is designed for positional support. It is not designed for restraint, but we've seen cases where kids have been strapped in chairs. So mechanical restraint is about using some kind of equipment or device to restrict somebody's movement. Another type of restraint, well, let me get into some of the physical restraint types of variations. I'm not going to go over these in great detail, but I want to show a couple of examples. There's different forms of physical restraint. There's standing restraints, might be done by kind of one adult kind of crossing arms over a child. There are seated restraints that can be done. We also see supine restraints, and a supine restraint, and from the description here, begins with a takedown. It's taking somebody down to the ground. In a supine position, it is a face-up position. But again, this is a position that can introduce more danger. And of course, prone restraint, many of you have probably heard of before. Prone restraint has made the news, not only talking about kids in school, but has made the news in law enforcement and other settings where individuals have died of prone restraint. Individuals have died saying things like, "I can't breathe." Prone restraint is a face-down restraint. It begins with a takedown, and it can be quite dangerous. Fortunately, this is prohibited in Maryland, but it is allowed in many other states. In fact, California recently just introduced legislation to ban prone restraint. More states than not have banned prone restraint. Another thing I want to talk about is seclusion. Seclusion is involuntary confinement of a student alone in a room or area from which they are prevented from leaving. What does that mean? It means, again, you are forcing a child in a room or area against their will, and you're not letting them leave. What might that look like? Well, here's a picture here. This is a padded room. It could be a padded room. It could be a small cinder block closet. It could be a lot of things we see kids sometimes put into. Seclusion does not include a timeout, which might be taking the child to a different location with an adult and helping them. So it's not part of kind of a behavioral intervention plan. It is actually kind of forced separation and not letting a kid out. I do want to point out here that, we have seen seclusion rooms with lots of different names, called lots of different things, and come in lots of different sizes. But what you call the room is not important. How the room is used is what's important. So whether you call it a cool down room or a blue room or a break room, that doesn't matter. If you're putting a child in there against their will and not letting them leave, that is seclusion. Now, that is now not legal in our public schools, and it is much more limited now in our non-public schools, and it should go away completely. But we'll cover that more. I do want to point out here, and this is really important, because seclusion is not a true sensory room. If you've got a sensory room for children that actually benefit from, sensory stimulation, or on the other hand, someplace that's quiet, we're not talking about, getting rid of sensory rooms. A sensory room that's well equipped with an adult there to help a child, or even an adult that might step aside while the child takes a moment, that's fine. A self-directed break is not seclusion. So if a child identifies, if part of their IP says, I need a quiet place to go, or better yet, I need a safe person I can go to if I'm having a difficult time, that would not be considered seclusion. And of course, a timeout, taking a child to a supervised area is not seclusion either. Now, in my mind, it can move into seclusion very quickly if certain things are done. I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So Maryland law around physical restraint. So Maryland law says that physical restraint says much what the federal guidance says, should not be used unless you've kind of tried all of the other things you can try. It's a crisis situation, and it is necessary to protect the student or another individual from imminent serious physical harm. So in Maryland law, you should have tried less intrusive non-physical interventions before you would consider going to a restraint. And again, imminent serious physical harm, we're going to talk more about that in a few moments. It should only be done by people with appropriate training. And of course, it should only use a reasonable amount of force necessary to protect somebody from imminent serious physical harm. And of course, it should stop as soon as the child no longer poses the threat of imminent serious physical harm. So that phrase keeps coming up here. The law also stipulates it may not exceed 30 minutes. It should not exceed more than a few minutes. But that's what our law says. Now, in applying physical restraint, you can't use a face down position in Maryland. You can't use a position that might obstruct their airway. You can't straddle a student. There's a number of things that you shouldn't be doing in terms of what Maryland law says. In terms of seclusion is now prohibited in all public schools. That's a huge win. So as of the legislation that we got passed about 2 years ago, seclusion is no longer allowed in our public schools. It is not allowed in the non-public schools unless all of the other criteria has to apply here, unless there is a crisis situation, you've tried everything else you can try, and it's needed to avoid imminent serious physical harm in our non-public schools. So it can be used, again, in that situation of imminent serious physical harm if you've gone through these other things. The other thing that we had added to the law more recently limits the staff that can actually initiate and oversee the use of seclusion. Part of the reason for doing that, quite frankly, was to try to reduce the use of seclusion. I would love to see, and I will work until it happens, the use of seclusion prohibited in all of our non-public schools as well. There are far better things that we can be doing aside from secluding children, but that is something that takes time. So as of right now, the law kind of stipulates that there are certain people that are able to do it, and I'll review that a little bit with you as well. Here's the list. It's a licensed physician, and again, there's stipulations here, a psychologist license under Title 18, a clinical social worker, clinical is important, a registered nurse, or a clinical professional counselor. So there's only these 5 roles that can actually initiate or oversee a seclusion. It cannot be done by anyone that does not hold one of those credentials. And again, part of the reason for doing that is to limit the scope of seclusion, but we also wanted to make sure that people that were doing that were clinically familiar with the children and able to understand if they had any potential concerns or reasons that they should not be doing that. And for some reason, it looks like my video froze, and I might stop that there for a moment, but we'll give it a second and see if it catches up here. So about seclusion rooms, there are laws around the seclusion rooms say that they should be free of objects, that school personnel should always have a view of the student if they're in that room, and they should have adequate lighting and ventilation. I say we should get rid of the seclusion rooms, but that's we'll get there. A couple of other things to know about Maryland law. One is that if a child is restrained or secluded, you should get verbal notification or written notification within 24 hours. That is critical. I believe, quite frankly, that it should happen the same day or as soon as possible, because if your child is restrained or secluded at school, it is a potentially extremely traumatic situation. And you need to know when that child comes home that they went through something that could lead to significant trauma for them. So, of course, you do need to be notified. We have a lot of issues around underreporting and misreporting. There's also something new in our law as of the latest iteration that says that if a child is restrained or secluded 10 times, that's excessive, and that they are required to contact the Maryland State Department of Education and develop a corrective action plan. The repeated use of restraint or seclusion is really an indication that you are failing to meet a child's needs. So this was added in the law, and this should follow the child, not the school. So if a child begins in a public school and is restrained 3 times and goes to a non-public school and is restrained 7 times, then that 7th time would actually be when notification would need to happen, because that's the cumulative, it's following the child. So those are other things to know about what Maryland law says. Now, back to serious physical harm. Imminent serious physical harm actually has the same meaning as serious bodily injury. There is a definition in IDEA, but serious physical harm means that there is a substantial risk of death, extreme physical pain, protracted and obvious disfigurement, or protracted loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. This is a high bar. This is a really high bar. This is not a kick, a scratch, a bruise, a bite. This is, if we do not use a physical restraint or a seclusion, someone could potentially die. That is the intent of what the law says. I will tell you that that's not what has happened in practice for many, many years, but that is absolutely what our law says. So it's important to realize that. So despite that high standard, what I would tell you is that the majority of cases of restrained seclusion that we see are for noncompliance, for disrespect, for minor behaviors. Sometimes it's bad language, sometimes it's punishment, property damage, and convenience. And I am very sympathetic to the challenges that are faced in our classrooms. I'm very sympathetic to not having resources, but you cannot do something like seclude someone because you don't have enough resources. IDA says that's wrong, and quite honestly, your own human moral compass should say that that's wrong. And again, a lot of stories here. My son once was restrained and secluded for splashing water. A young man pictured over here on the left, he threw a sandwich. It ended up killing him. He threw a sandwich in the cafeteria. He was put in a prone restraint. It killed him. I've known kids for turning light switches off and on, or elopement, refusing to take a break, you should not go from failure to do a worksheet to being physically restrained. If you do, many things have gone wrong. Many things have gone wrong that are preventable. And that's where a lot of this work is. It's upstream to figure out what's happening. I do want to share a little bit of data with you here while we're talking about restraint seclusion instances. And to point out, when you look at this data, March 12th, 2020 to March 1st, 2021, we had COVID. So you'll see a big dip there. That wasn't that suddenly we were doing this really great job. That was that many kids were now at home and fortunately not being restrained and secluded. But that explains why you see here in 2021 and 2022 kind of that dip. But if you go back to 2017, 2018, that was the first report that was published. That report I managed to get my hands on, although at the time MSD did not make that readily publicly available. I got the report not long after it came out, and it was that data that actually led me to find out that my school district, Calvert County, small rural district in Southern Maryland, was number 1 in the use of seclusion, number 2 in the use of restraint in the state. Frederick, Maryland was our company. They were number 1 in restraint, number 2 in seclusion. That data was really important. And it wasn't until I had that data that I really realized kind of what was going on. But if you look at the instance data there, the good news is there's a trend. There's a trend that restraint and seclusion are going down. I would like to think that the work that we're doing, the work that many advocates are doing, the work that many organizations are doing has had some impact on this. If you go to 2017, 2018 versus 22, 23, there has been a significant reduction in the use of physical restraint. Now, we also know that reporting issues happen. So we don't want to celebrate too much because we want to make sure that things are happening the way they should. Seclusion follows a similar path. Now, I want to point out to you that the series in the red is public and the series in the yellow is non-public. But if you look at the bars, you'll see that in many cases, the public bars are as high, if not higher, than the public. And what's interesting there is the public schools serve many, 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 many more children than are the non-public schools. The non-public schools serve a very few, a very small number of children, but have the majority of instances here. Now, of course, they would say that, well, we're working with kids that weren't successful in a public school, and they would tell you that there's more behavior, and that's why they're seeing those higher numbers. We can do better than that. But anyway, the trend here I want you to notice is that for what it's worth, that there has been some progress here in Maryland. We are seeing a reduction. And again, lots of factors. The DOJ investigation certainly helped. The change in law certainly helps. Advocates being aware certainly helps. I do want to point out to you that there's some great resources now on the Maryland State Department of Education website. If you search restraint seclusion, state of Maryland, you will find a little website there that has frequently asked questions, although they could expand that a bit. There's some great topics that are covered there. The other thing you can find there are the annual reports. So you can find the data reports that have the data that I just showed you. One of the things that we had changed in the law most recently is we wanted the data to, what we had previously was it showed each of the districts, their numbers for restraint seclusion. It showed it disaggregated by disability. It showed one giant pot for non-public schools. So they were all put together in one giant pot. we push to have that broken down by the non-public schools. I think as a parent, and I know when I ultimately worked and my son was actually moved into a non-public school, we wanted one that didn't use restraint seclusion, which was a tough find, but we found one and they worked wonderfully with him and he's had a really great outcome. But I think a parent should be able to access that data and know which schools are using these things more than other schools. So lots of resources there. I do want to just share, again, lots of concerns to carry forward here. There's a lot of concern about underreporting data. Any parent that's experienced this before will probably tell you for every instance that was reported, there may have been other instances that were not reported or instances where you suspect that these things have happened and there have been denials. We also have some concerns around the idea of transports. One of the things that we see sometimes happen is that kids are being physically restrained and schools have been referring to them as transports because the law kind of mentions moving a child from one area to another and they're not reporting it. Anytime you put hands on a kid and you are restricting their ability to move, it should be reported. That may be something that needs to be fixed in the law. But nonetheless, that's always a concern as well. And another concern is, with the prohibitions on seclusion, sometimes we see things that are happening that I used to use the word seclusion light, but it's seclusion, but for one reason or another, it might not be being reported. For example, if you, instead of having a child alone in a room, you are in the room and you say, well, he's not alone, so it's not seclusion. Well, I would tell you that if you were in that room and you were there to help the child, if you're there to help them to regulate and to ultimately kind of reach a point where they're doing better, I would agree that's not seclusion. But if you are only in the room in body and you're not helping the child, you're only there kind of dictating, the rules to them, very quickly it can turn into seclusion. So there are some concerns around that as well. I do want to share a couple of common myths here. One of the things that we sometimes hear are ideas like, well, restraint is safe. Or it's safe when performed by trained staff, or some kids like it. I've even heard that. Anytime you physically restrain any human being, there is a risk. Anytime you go hands-on, you will likely put a human being into a fight or flight response mode. When an individual goes into a fight or flight response mode, they will flail their arms, they will kick, they will spit, they will try to get free. When the staff member gets hit in the head after the child is flailing their arms, they may go into a fight or flight response mode. These things can become quite dangerous. When we go into a fight or flight response mode, our prefrontal cortex, the thinking rational part of our brain, goes offline. There's a tremendous amount of risk anytime you go hands-on with a kid. We hear things like, well, seclusion helps kids calm down. There is nothing calming about being put into a room against your will and not let out. Kids go into those rooms, and again, they are put there by force most often. So people sometimes say, well, it's better than restraint. Well, no, they often get there through a restraint, because if it's an involuntary confinement, you often have to restrain them before you put them in that seclusion space. But once they get in there, they will bang, they will scream, they will call for their parents. They may urinate or defecate out of a stress response. Maybe in 20 or 30, maybe in 20 minutes, their head goes down and they slouch down. They're not calming down. This is a brainstem response. It's a survival response that kids go into when they feel so distressed that they have nothing that they can do. Some kids even dissociate when they're in seclusion rooms. We hear things like, well, what else do you expect us to do? There's nothing else. We have to keep everyone safe. And the truth of the matter is there are far better things we can and should do to reduce and eliminate these practices. And we've done it. Calvert County, I mentioned, the year that this happened to my son, they had 750 seclusions, over 500 restraints. We introduced new training. We changed a policy this past year. They had no seclusions. They had around 10 restraints. It's absolutely possible to reduce and eliminate these practices. Part 2 here, I want to talk about the impact of restraint seclusion. And I'm going to move through this relatively quickly, but I want to talk about who's impacted, and then I want to talk about what that impact is, from trauma to injury to death in the school to prison pipeline. The first thing we know is that autistic children are far more likely to be impacted by restraint seclusion. If we look at the data, children with disabilities, Black and brown children, kids with a trauma history, far more likely to be restrained and secluded to a tremendous extent. Oftentimes we find other children that have trauma background, kids that are adopted, kids in the foster care system, kids with generational trauma. If you're familiar with the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, you could look into that and find, again, kids that have a trauma history far more likely to be restrained and secluded. And this often happens really because many children are misunderstood in the name of behavior. There's a lot of reasons this happens. We could have a different presentation on this, so I don't have an opportunity to dive into it today, but that misunderstanding of a child in the name of their behavior leads to restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, and corporal punishment. And again, it can lead a child down the school to prison pipeline. Much of this has to do with a lot of the approaches that are taken in our schools today, a lot of focus on compliance, a lot of focus on behavior, and approaches that aren't working for many of our kids that really need help the most. And even in the way we look at disability, whether it's through a lens of kind of a deficit lens or looking at how we remove, impairments in the environment to better support people, that affects how kids might be misunderstood. So again, looking at the disproportionality of data, I'm just going to highlight the federal data here, but 80% of restraints, kids with disabilities, 77% of seclusion, kids with disabilities. Of course, they make up about 16% of our enrollment. When I've looked at Maryland data in the past, it's been as high as 95 and 98% kids with disabilities. This is certainly happening in a way that heavily affects children with disabilities. Breaking down data further, you'll find that autistic children and children that come in under an emotional disturbance or emotional category, I don't like that category. These are kids that are often, honestly, kids that have survived a lot of trauma. But children in those two categories tend to see it at the highest rates. If you are a non-speaking autistic child, you might be at an increased risk as well. And of course, there are a lot of concerns there in terms of children not being able to share with you the experiences that they might have had. So this is really important as a parent of an autistic child. Oops. So trauma, trauma affects the brain. We say that, and we mean that literally. Trauma causes changes in the brain, and those changes are lifelong. And what we find is that if you look at the intersection of trauma and disability, there's often a huge intersection there between trauma and disability. If you are an individual with a disability, if you are a neurodivergent individual living in a neurotypical world, the world is often not very accommodating to you. Often there's a lot of trauma that can be related to not having your needs appropriately met, not having your voice appropriately heard. So it's really important to understand there's a huge intersection when we look at trauma and disability. But one of the things that we know is that kids that have been traumatized, anyone that's been traumatized, it can cause changes in your brain. And those changes in the brain can cause you to be hypervigilant, kind of always on alert, not feeling safe. And that can lead you to a higher chance of having distress behavior. If that distress behavior is met with compliance demands, very often it escalates the situation. Very often that's where we see things like restrained seclusion happen. As the child becomes escalated, they go into a fight or flight response mode. They might elope to try to get away. They might knock over a desk or a chair. And very often that leads to our restraint and seclusion or other punishment. And guess what? That punishment is further traumatizing. So every time we do this to a child, every time we restrain or seclude a child, we are adding to kind of the trauma that they've experienced and actually making behaviors more likely, not less likely. That's, again, one of the reasons these things should really, seclusion should never happen. Restraint should be exceedingly rare. The impact of this trauma has a really tremendous long-term effect. I know kids that have experienced this, that 10 years later can't sleep with their door shut at night, or will drive by the school where they were physically restrained and secluded and become sick, become nauseous. This really has a tremendous impact on kids, not just today. We often think that kids are really resilient, and children can be resilient, but trauma is not something that you just get over easily. And the other thing to point out here is that using restraint and seclusion, restraining or secluding a child, it's not a positive experience. This can actually be very traumatic for the staff as well. And as the staff are further traumatized, guess what? They're actually more likely to not feel safe themselves and more likely to go hands-on again in the future. And this is why we see that there are some staff members that seem to use these things at a far greater rate than others. It often relates back to their own trauma and their own experience. This can also be traumatic on our families. Anyone that's experienced this, you know what I'm talking about here. This can really be difficult. Seeing your child injured, seeing your child hurt, seeing your child experience something like this, I mean, my trauma led me to doing research, quitting my job, and trying to do something to cause a change here. It really can have a tremendous impact. And I would also say to you that seeing another child physically restrained or secluded, how safe do you feel if you're seeing it happen to another child in your classroom? It can be traumatic to those that witness this. The idea of secondary trauma is very real and can have a tremendous impact. And of course, we know kids are injured and we know children have died being physically restrained. There's a story recently out of Frederick, a child that had a broken leg, autistic student, after a physical restraint. We know that there are injuries that happen to the staff. We often hear the injuries to the staff as a justification for restraint seclusion. What I would tell you is that in more cases than not, those injuries happen once someone has gone hands-on with a kid, which is why we should do anything we can to avoid going hands-on. The moment we go hands-on, we're putting everybody at greater risk. I don't want to see staff injured. You don't want to see staff injured. And it really takes a toll on educators, kind of being in these situations. We need to go upstream. We need to work to reduce reduce a lot of these things, not dealing with crisis, but actually preventing things from happening by really working upstream. And of course, I've mentioned some of the tragic deaths here already. Cornelius Fredericks threw a sandwich, was put into a prone restraint that killed him. Max Benson, we talked about at the top of the hour here. Angelina Arndt, very young, 7 years old, was put into a restraint that killed her. There have absolutely been avoidable loss of life that we need to be concerned about. One of the other things that happens with all of this is that kids that are being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment, school is not a friendly place. School is not a welcoming place. Kids will probably develop school avoidance, not want to go to school. Would you want to go to someplace where these things happen to you? Well, kids that end up in that situation are more likely to end up down that school to prison pipeline. And the school to prison pipeline is a very real phenomenon where, children that are over disciplined, when school is not friendly, school is not welcoming, they become disengaged. Disengaged kids are more likely to drop out, end up in juvenile justice, end up in the criminal justice system. I've got data that I can share with you, but it talks about, how many individuals with disabilities are in our prisons. And again, so many of these outcomes are avoidable if we change course in what we're doing. The final thing I want to talk about here, and I'm going to do this over the next 10 minutes or so, and we're going to have some time for questions, is what you might do if this is happening to you, or what you might do to try to help bring about a bigger change. One thing I want to say is that I'm a big believer in collaboration. So whenever we can collaborate, it's a great place to start. If we can work with our school, work with our teachers, work with our Board of Education, whatever it may be, that's a great place to start. Doesn't always work, but it's a great place to start. But we're going to talk about other things you can do, from getting help from other organizations to filing complaints to other action that you might take if you find yourself in a situation where you have a child that's being restrained or secluded, or maybe you're somebody that's an advocate and helps others that are going through these situations, what you might recommend to them in terms of trying to bring about change. And again, think about how you can work with your school, meet with your teacher, meet with your administrator, share your concerns. If your child is being restrained and secluded, requesting an IEP meeting. To me, if I find a kid that's being restrained and secluded, what I really see below the surface is a child whose needs are not being appropriately met. So that's where we need to focus. How do we appropriately meet that child's needs so we're not moving into crisis situations and moving into crisis management? And of course, you can reach out to your Board of Education. Part of how I was able to work successfully in my own school district was meeting with members of my Board of Education one-on-one and sharing our story with photographs and descriptions of what happened, and asking for their help to pass a better policy. So there are things that we can do to try to collaborate with our school. And I certainly recommend those things. I want to see people advocating for solutions. And again, whole nother presentation here, but what are the solutions? What is the better way? In my mind, it's about trauma-informed approaches. It's about neuroscience. We've learned more about the human brain and behavior over the last couple of decades than we knew in all of time before that. Yet we still rely on a lot of behavioral approaches that were developed well over 100 years ago. We still put a lot of focus on reward and consequence models that aren't working for a lot of our kids. I'm also a huge believer in kind of relationship-driven approaches. And again, collaboration. It's not about doing things to people. It's not about doing things for people. It's about doing things with people. And that should follow our approaches in terms of how to better support individuals. A no consent letter. This is an option as well. We have a template on our website. A no consent letter basically says it's a letter you can send to your school and say, I don't consent to restraint seclusion being used on my child. Now, does that stop the school from doing it? No, the school still follows the law and they can still restrain or seclude your child. But what it does is it can start a conversation. It can start this idea that you are concerned about these things, and it can give you an opportunity to be proactive and say with the school, I don't agree to the use of these things, and I would like to talk to make sure that we can come up with plans so these things are never necessary. So again, that can be a proactive step you can take, and it can be a collaborative one as well. I realize it may sound like, okay, well, I'm going to write this letter and they're going to stop doing this. That's not necessarily what it will do, but it can have an impact. We have a great template that was written by an attorney. There's a lot of organizations you can reach out to for help. Disability Rights Maryland is our state protection and advocacy organization. I actually work with Leslie Margolis over at Disability Rights Maryland on the legislation that was passed a couple of years ago. They've done a lot of work around restraint seclusion. Leslie has been a pioneer in this, probably going back to that 2003 law as well. There's other organizations out there, Parents Place of Maryland and Maryland Coalition of Family, both offer a lot of great training support. COPA, which is the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates, also offers not only some fantastic training, advocacy training, but they're very concerned about these issues on a national level as well, and actually run what's called the Appraise Coalition. And of course, we're here to help. The Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, always happy to work with families and parents, if you're looking for help. Now, if you're trying to do things and not having luck, you do have some options in terms of filing complaints. One option is underneath the IDEA. So if your child has an IEP, you can file a state complaint. Now, a state complaint, if you're complaining because of the use of restraint seclusion, really what this comes down to is what the Office of Civil Rights had pointed out, that the use of restraint seclusion can lead to a denial of a free and appropriate public education. Your child's rights are being interfered with, and their right to that free and appropriate public education, can be an issue. So you can file a state complaint. The state will review your complaint. They will come up with findings, and likely they will come back and talk about guidance and training. Is that enough? I can't tell you that. It's not always enough. I can tell you that. But certainly that is one of the things that you might consider doing. You could also file a complaint through the Office of Civil Rights. So the use of restraint and seclusion can be discriminatory. If your child is a child with a disability, if your child is a Black or brown child, if your child, this falls underneath the purview of the Office of Civil Rights. And you can file a federal complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. OCR, if they choose to pick up your complaint, will investigate, may try to negotiate something with the school district, may require certain things to be done. Certainly no school district wants to have the federal government investigating them. This is something that you can do. Now, I do want to point out that you cannot file the same complaint at all of these places. You can file unique complaints, but it can't be the same complaint because they will not all pick up a complaint once you've filed it somewhere else. The Department of Justice, of course, here in Maryland, we know about because of the investigation that happened in Frederick County, but their Educational Opportunity section has been doing some really inspiring work around the use of seclusion, more so seclusion than restraint. They are interested in both, but they've done a lot of focus on the improper use of seclusion. They have an entire website set up that looks at seclusion. They have authority under the Americans with Disabilities Act. They are looking for systemic issues, and I say that based on experience. So if you're thinking about filing with DOJ and you know others that might also file in the same area, that can be helpful in getting their attention. They have a pretty heavy workload, but they are doing a lot of work, and their investigations have been significant. The findings, all of their findings over the last few years have resulted in the elimination of seclusion. They have told me that they have yet to find an appropriate use of seclusion. So they're doing some great work there as well. And just to wrap up here, a couple of more things that you might think about. And again, what do I do if my child's being restrained and secluded? You work with the school, think about filing a complaint. There are other venues. You can look for media coverage. It can be hard to find people to pick up stories. If they do pick up stories, you've got a lot of work to educate them on the issues. Media stories can make an impact. Stories, Chicago Tribune, ProPublica did a huge series called The Quiet Rooms. It led to a change in law in the state. The reporting that was done in Frederick County, I think, had a lot of impact as well. These stories can have a lot of impact, a lot of positive impact, but they can be a double-edged sword. You will find very quickly that not everyone is empathetic about your trauma, your child's trauma. There are a lot of people that have a lot of views around children and children with disabilities that to me are pretty disgusting. And very quickly, if you have a story published in the news and you happen to go on their social media, I implore you not to read the comments. You will find some supportive ones, but you will also find some things that will diminish your faith in humanity. That said, these stories as a whole can really result in positive change, but you've got to be aware it can be a double-edged sword. You can hire an attorney. Now, I say that as if, it's an easy thing to do, but civil litigation can lead to change. Of course, it can be very costly, but, it can lead to changes in law. There was a big case in Fairfax County, Virginia, a couple of years ago. 5 plaintiffs, a number of organizational plaintiffs. That led ultimately to a settlement agreement. I wish it had gone a little further, but that settlement agreement led to a elimination of seclusion, reduction of restraint, bringing in new and different approaches. So it made progress. So, certainly civil litigation can be something you consider as well. And of course, one final thing to mention is that meet with your lawmakers. I would not have thought, so if I go back in time 6 years ago, I would not have even ever imagined that I might go meet with a state or federal lawmaker and implore them to pass legislation. I met with many now, and what I can tell you is that your state level lawmakers, your delegates, your senators that represent you, they want to hear from you. They want to hear from their constituents. They are there to represent you. You can make an appointment. You can share your story. You can ask for change. And we have more power sometimes than we realize. Again, started the presentation, I'm just the dad, but just the dad that helped manage to change the law here in Maryland. I've helped to change laws in other states as well. These are things that we can do. And of course, we can work with organizations that we work with or are part of as well, and they can have influence. So a lot we can do in terms of that front. And I always love this quote from Margaret Mead, and it's a good one to kind of leave and to transition to questions. But, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. We often have more power than we think, but when these things are happening to us, we can feel really powerless, and it can be really difficult. I started the Alliance initially. One of my primary goals when I started the organization was I wanted people to know that they weren't alone. And I wanted them to know that they could influence change. As we've grown, our mission has grown and what we're trying to do has grown. But still, that's a really important starting point, is just knowing that there are others out there and, we can do better. And, back to where we open this with, if we can do better, I think we have an obligation to do better. So my contact information, of course, is here and is available. I would welcome anybody to reach out anytime. Always happy to have a conversation, whether you're an educator or a parent or an advocate, how can we do better? Always happy to have a conversation. The slides will be made available to you as well. So if you want to download those, you can. And with that, I will wrap up, stop sharing my screen, and we'll make some time for questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Guy. My name is Julie Hall, and I'm one of the volunteers for xMinds, and I'm here to actually try to help moderate the Q&A section. Some of them came in during the presentation in the chat, and actually you were so organized and presented such great information that you pretty much answered some of the questions that already came in. And so I just wanted to kind of clean up the chat questions and kind of make sure that those get addressed. But once we finish that up, if you want to ask a question out loud to any of the people who are on Zoom right now, just raise your hand using the reaction button on your menu. And when I call on you, you can unmute yourself, then please mute yourself again when you're finished. So the first question that I wanted to highlight that came in through the chat was, what was restraint and seclusion was taught to us by a PCIT therapist in Columbia, Maryland. And when I was directed to a counselor through Kennedy Krieger, the counselors practice PCIT. If seclusion and restraint is being taught directly to the parents by autism experts, how can we have faith that change will happen in schools? How can we, how can we address the need to have the therapeutic world be included in these change practices?
Yeah, great question, and I would say that I don't believe that. Well, certainly don't believe that seclusion should ever be taught to. And what's interesting is that oftentimes what is being taught is not always reflective of the curriculum. So, for example, one of the larger training providers in crisis management is Crisis Prevention Institute, CPI. My child's school was trained in CPI. My son was restrained and secluded in the CPI, in the name of CPI. And I remember very clearly staff holding up their training badge and saying, "We are trained in safe, restraint, and seclusion by CPI." Of course, there were two problems with that statement. One is that CPI doesn't actually teach a use of seclusion. They don't endorse the use of seclusion. They don't recommend the use of seclusion. In fact, I've actually gotten them to testify on bills to eliminate seclusion. And of course, there's no such thing as safe restraint. So often we hear people referencing training, and there is often a disconnect between what the training says and what people are actually doing or teaching. That said, back to your question, there are alternatives. And what I would say is that certainly there are families that are working and doing their very, very best in situations that are very difficult, that may have children that are having very big behaviors that can be risky. There are alternatives as well in things that we can do other than restraint seclusion. I'd far rather see parents trained in. One of the alternatives that we brought into Calvert County, and it's been brought into other places as well, is something called UKERU, which is spelled UKERU. UKERU is a trauma-informed alternative to restraint seclusion. UKERU came out of a group in Virginia called Grafton Integrated Health. Grafton Integrated Health runs a number of non-public schools and special education day schools and residential schools. These are schools that were working with kids that had not been successful in a lot of other environments and came in with lots of very large behavior. Many, many years ago, if you go back 20 years, they used a tremendous amount of restraint seclusion. They also had a lot of injuries to staff. They had a lot of workman's compensation claims. And all of that led to a point where they eventually had a new CEO that came in and said, "We've got to get out of the restraint seclusion business. We've got to do something different." They developed this program called UKERU, which uses specialized pads, and they completely eliminate seclusion, and restraint is exceedingly rare. But they actually teach that, or will teach that, to families, and they encourage the places that get their training to teach that to families as well. So there are things we can be teaching to families. What I really want to see, though, is really more upstream work. How do we move away from crisis management into really preventing crisis in the first place? And it's not to say that you're going to be 100% there, but there's a lot of things we can and should be doing. So yes, we need to, and I have, through the Alliance, worked with, we work with a lot of people in a lot of different settings. But yeah, there are still places out there that are training parents in things that we shouldn't be doing. And that's a longer term change. I would welcome a conversation with anyone that's providing that kind of training to parents, and as a way to point them in other directions, because I think that's important.
Also, we had some parents submit questions ahead of time, and it just seems like a follow-up question to what you were just mentioning with UKERU. The question was, do you also advocate for the nonviolent crisis intervention training? And would that be categorized as a nonviolent crisis intervention training, or would you say it's the sort of upstream things that you kind of reference that would fall under that category?
That's a great question, and it actually it lets me kind of talk about something that you know, there's a lot of ways that we've been trying to promote change. So we've been trying to change laws and policies. We're also trying and change hearts and minds as well. Like, how do we get people the better things they can and should be doing to better support children? How do we move people away from, you know, failed approaches that are not working? So what's interesting here is nonviolent crisis intervention. That is the training provided through the Crisis Prevention Institute. That nonviolent crisis intervention training includes de-escalation, and it also includes physical skills or holds or restraints. So CPI training is both de-escalation and restraints. Interestingly enough, I told you that my son was restrained and secluded in the name of CPI. About 1.5 years ago, we entered into a collaboration with Crisis Prevention Institute. And there's a whole long story behind that. And your initial thought is probably like, why on earth would the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, an organization that wants to get rid of seclusion and reduce restraint, why would they be collaborating with a company that actually teaches the use of holds or restraints? Well, the truth is that there's an opportunity for change. We began about 1.5 years ago in a partnership where we're doing some work with CPI, and we have done a couple of things. One, we influence changes in their current training. The 3rd edition of their training, which just came out last summer, we influenced in quite a few ways. One of the things that we influenced in that training was that as part of their training now, they share, anybody that's done the 3rd edition training would have seen this, but they've shared lived experience videos. And part of the idea behind that is that I told them after I took their training before that they need people to understand how traumatic the use of restraint can be. And to do that, they've recorded these videos of people that have been physically restrained or their children have been restrained. And that's part of the training now. They share that as part of their training so people understand that if you do this, it could really lead to a significant amount of trauma. But what's more important is we started about 1.5 years ago, working on a program with CPI, and it's called Reframing Behavior. It's actually coming out in May. And the idea behind this is that one of the first things I said when I met with the president of CPI is I said, Crisis Prevention Institute, we're not doing the P. You're not preventing crisis. You're managing crisis situations, and what we're doing is building a program that is going to be bringing brain science and trauma-informed approaches upstream to schools to help them avoid needing things like restrained seclusion in the first place. So, there are a number of different things that you can get trained in out there. I'm a big proponent of Dr. Mona Delahook's work, Beyond Behaviors. Any of you that are familiar with Dr. Ross Green and Collaborative Proactive Solutions, there are a number of different alternatives out there to help people move in different directions. And again, my bigger term for this is trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, relationship-driven, and collaborative. Those are the directions we need to move if we want to go upstream and better support kids and avoid these situations that are turning into crises. So I hope that got to the question, but nonviolent crisis intervention is CPI's training, and we're actually working with them actively right now, not only to create new training, but to reshape the training that they have to move away from, and of course they've actually, they came on board with us when we decided to work with them. One of the things I said is, oh, well, it would make a lot of sense for us to collaborate together. If I knew that you were aligned with us in eliminating seclusion and reducing restraint. A little over 1 year ago, they put out a press release saying they are aligned with the work of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint in eliminating seclusion, reducing restraint. So we're coming at this from a lot of different angles, but there are trainings out there that parents might consider. Collaborative Proactive Solutions is a good one, and there's other things that'll be available as well.
Great, thank you so much. I think Irfan has his hand up for a question.
Great.
Good evening, Mr. Stevens. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. And thank you so much for your presentation. It's very powerful. And of course, for your work. My family, my son was subjected to seclusion and restraint, and I know how traumatizing it is for everyone involved. My question relates to Maryland law in terms of, many students are publicly funded, but they are in private schools.
Yep.
How does the law treat those individuals, and is this an area where there's kind of interpretive guidance if it's not explicit in the law itself? Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just begin by saying I'm very sorry to hear what was done to your child and what you've experienced, because I do know how difficult it can be. So our law here in Maryland covers both our public and non-public schools. So if your child is being placed in a non-public school through the IEP process, so you've got a non-public placement, the laws in Maryland cover that. Now, the difference in the law by and large is related to the update related to seclusion. So in public schools, you cannot seclude a child any longer. It is still allowed in the non-public schools, but only under those situations that we talked about earlier, and only when done by only when supervised and initiated by one of 5 different types of staff members. But our other laws, I mean, all of this should apply to your non-public placements as well.
Okay, so the source of funding doesn't affect their designation. It's just where they're seated in terms of the students, whether they're public or non-public.
Right. So yeah, if they are, this law covers the non-public schools, and non-public schools, in theory, you could do a private placement, although most kids that are non-publics are placed through the local school system. But it would affect both of those students, whether they were a private placement or a public placement.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
The next one is a short question. What was the name of the doctor you liked in addition to Ross Green?
Dr. Mona de la Hook. Dr. Mona de la Hook has, and I can rattle off more, but Dr. Mona de la Hook has an amazing book called Beyond Behaviors. And it really gets into one of the things I talk about a lot, and I didn't tonight because we were focused really specifically on restrained seclusion and kind of Maryland law, but is the neuroscience of behavior. And Mona's work really gets into a lot of what we do in our schools today, and this is not to say all, but a lot of what we do, as I said earlier, is really kind of based on, late 1800s, early 1900 behaviorism. A lot of it's based on reward and punishment, reward and consequence, operant conditioning. Mona's work gets into really the neuroscience behind behavior and kind of getting below the iceberg, right? Behavior is just what we see. What we really want to understand is what's going on below, and really acknowledge that, people tend to look at behavior as all being intentional. Not all of our behavior is intentional. In fact, when you're looking at young children, when you're looking at children with disabilities, you will find that far more behavior is what we would call kind of bottom-up behavior. Bottom up as opposed to top down. Top down is cognitive, right? That's our brain. That's kind of thoughtful. But a lot of our behavior, anybody ever heard the term behavior is communication? I like to go one more step up and say behavior is biology. A lot of our behavior is driven by our biology to keep ourselves safe. And when we don't feel safe, when we've experienced trauma, we are far more likely to have kind of stress-related behaviors. Anyway, I'm getting a long answer. Mona de la Hook. Dr. Lori Desautel is another great one. Dr. Lori Desautel has a great book called Connections Over Compliance. Ross Green's books, Lost in School, a great book as well. A lot of fantastic resources out there.
I think I can pull from some of our prior questions. Do you have virtual outreach capacity for parents and grandparents living overseas, or resources for people overseas?
Yeah, so we are, I started this in Maryland. We are very much a national organization. I often say that we're somewhat international as well. In fact, I think I may have seen on here earlier our lead Canadian volunteer, if I'm not mistaken, Chantel. But we have, we do a lot of work here in the United States. We do a lot of, it's kind of talking about outreach. We do a lot of educational work. So one of the things that we do on a regular basis, every 2 weeks, we do live events, much like, that you're doing here tonight. And we do live events with experts, with educators, with families, with self-advocates, with other folks. We have a very international audience for this. So when we go on live, I always kind of make the joke that, we should see our friends from Australia soon. or New Zealand or wherever it may be. And quite frankly, you know, we live in a world today that's really amazing because I can jump on a Zoom meeting with somebody in Australia, and I'm happy to. So the short answer is anyone, anywhere, if we can help in some way. And again, you know, there are places like Canada where, you know, perhaps we're a little bit more structured, but anywhere, anytime that we can help, I'm happy to. Always happy to set up a Zoom meeting and talk to somebody wherever they might be.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Another interesting question that I saw was, how soon after a restraint or seclusion occurs are teachers required to inform parents?
So, oh gosh, I went over that earlier, and it's I want to say it was 24 hours. I mean, in my mind, it should happen immediately. I mean, a child. So, you know, being physically restrained or secluded, it has a tremendous impact. I mean, being, for instance, being held down to the ground by someone that is there in a position that you should be able to trust. Wow, it really is traumatic for kids. And, you know, I don't think a child should go home without a parent knowing that they went through this really huge traumatic event today. You know, one of the things that parents will see, and this is in the longer term, but if you have a child that's being restrained and secluded, your child's going to change. Your child's going to be under a lot of stress and a lot of impact of trauma. And one of the things that I remember as, you know, kind of my journey was kind of getting to the point where my son was in a place where he was safe. These things weren't happening to him. And he was beginning to heal from this. And it was like suddenly I had my kid back. I'll tell you, it can be heartbreaking to know that, you know, and as a parent, you know, especially with very young kids, you're sending your child to school. Maybe they're having school avoidance and you're sending them there and this is happening to them. It can actually really have an impact on your relationships with your child. So anyway, short answer. Every time you ask me a question, I know I get off on a little bit of a tangent, but yeah, there's a state requirement in terms of notification. My feeling is it should happen sooner than that because a child should not go onto a bus or go home without the parent knowing that, hey, there was this really traumatic thing that happened today. And think about this for a second. Restraint or seclusion is not appropriate unless it's a situation that involves imminent serious physical harm. What's that saying? There was a potentially life-threatening situation today. Why would you send a child home without the parent knowing that there was a potentially life-threatening situation today? Shouldn't happen. We should probably close that window a little bit in terms of the notification.
And to follow up to that question, then how do you go about repairing the relationship after physical exchange or a traumatic incident? What's the first thing a parent should do to kind of to, you know, address that? I think this also will be our last question looking at the time.
Sure. You know, one is hear and validate, right? You know, don't just think, you know, my child's resilient and my child will be fine. I mean, quite frankly, you know, if you look at a physical restraint in progress, or you think about what happens when a kid is put in, imagine yourself being put in that room and having me hold the door shut. Imagine how absolutely terrifying that would be. It's significant. So, you know, I think it begins with, as a parent, by acknowledging and hearing and listening. It begins with, you know, what can you do? What can you do to change things? I know kids that had hundreds of instances of physical restraint and seclusion. And of course, it's a really tough situation because, you know, as a parent, not only do you have a right for your child to get a free and appropriate public education, you know, you might have a job and all your responsibilities, and you should be able to trust that your child's able to go to the school and be supported. But I would say hear, feel, validate, work on, you know, figuring out what needs to happen to change things, and you know, love your kids unconditionally. You know, kids that go through this are it affects their self-esteem. It affects how they view themselves. Get them therapy or counseling. Again, you know, this can be I know children that have developed post-traumatic stress disorder from the use of restraint and seclusion. So take it seriously, and you know, be there, be relational support.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Guy, for being here and sharing everything you know, especially sharing, you know, what was such a tragedy for your family, and creating ASR to help everyone in our community and really around the world. So you mentioned so many wonderful resources, and I just want to let everyone know that what we can do is we'll pull them together and make that list of resources for parents available along with the recording and your slides. And I just want to reiterate, if you want to look into this more, and Guy's organization, AASR, you can go to endseclusion.org. And then I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I hope you found this as helpful as I did. Before you go, Annie, I think, has put in the chat a link to a brief survey. We really do care about your feedback and what you have to say. So please share with us. And then I will just say one more thing about programming. xMinds is very busy with more events and resources for the autism community. So please save the date, February 20th and February 22nd, for the xMinds 2024 primers on MCPS placements for autistic students. If we've done this before, but if you attend live, this is Guy talked about collaboration. This is an opportunity for you all to hear directly from MCPS staff about autism services and to have your questions answered. So please put that on your calendar. Thank you, everyone, again for coming, and thank you, Guy, for your presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melanie, for the opportunity, and thank everybody that came, and don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of any help.